The autumn of 1994 painted Millbrook Valley in shades of amber and crimson, a small Pennsylvania town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were supposedly impossible to keep. Nestled between rolling hills and dense woodland, the community of just over 3,000 souls had always prided itself on being the kind of place where children could ride their bikes until dark, where front doors remained unlocked, and where the most scandalous news typically involved someone's prize-winning pumpkin at the county fair. But on the night of October 15, 1994, that illusion of safety would shatter forever, leaving behind a mystery so profound that it would haunt the town for decades to come. The story begins with three inseparable friends, all 17 years old, all seniors at Millbrook Valley High School. Their names were etched into the hearts of a community that would never forget them. Jessica Carmichael, Timothy Paul Henderson, and Amanda Fletcher. To understand the magnitude of their disappearance, one must first understand who they were not just to each other, but to everyone whose lives they touched. Jessica Carmichael was the kind of young woman who seemed to illuminate every room she entered. With shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the light like spun copper, and eyes the color of summer meadows, she possessed a natural charisma that drew people to her like moths to flame. The daughter of Robert Carmichael, who owned the town's only hardware store, and Linda Carmichael, a substitute teacher at the elementary school, Jessica had been raised with small-town values and big city dreams. She wrote for the school newspaper, sang in the church choir, and had already been accepted to Penn State University with plans to study journalism. Her teachers often remarked that she had an uncanny ability to see the story behind the story, to find the human element in even the most mundane events. Timothy Henderson, known to everyone as Timmy, was Jessica's polar opposite in many ways, yet somehow her perfect complement. Where she was outgoing and vivacious, he was thoughtful and introspective. The son of a Vietnam veteran turned mechanic, Timmy had inherited his father's gentle nature and his grandfather's love of photography. He could often be found wandering the outskirts of town with his beloved Canon AE-1, capturing the hidden beauty in abandoned barns, morning mist over forgotten ponds, and the weathered faces of elderly residents who had lived in Millbrook Valley their entire lives. His photographs had won several regional contests, and his art teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, had been encouraging him to apply to art schools. But Timmy seemed content to remain in his small corner of the world, finding endless inspiration in the familiar. Amanda Fletcher completed their trinity with a fierce intelligence that both impressed and occasionally intimidated her peers. The daughter of Patricia Fletcher, the town's only physician, and James Fletcher, a lawyer who commuted to the county seat, Amanda had been destined for greatness from an early age. She maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA, served as student council president, and had already been accepted to several Ivy League universities. Yet beneath her driven exterior lay a deeply loyal friend who would go to extraordinary lengths for those she loved. Her classmates might have found her intimidating in the classroom, but Jessica and Timmy knew her as the girl who would drive 20 miles in a snowstorm to bring soup to a sick friend, or spend her Saturday afternoons helping elderly neighbors with their grocery shopping. The three had been inseparable since middle school, an unlikely trio whose friendship had only grown stronger through the typical trials of adolescence. They spent their free time exploring the vast network of hiking trails that crisscrossed the hills surrounding Millbrook Valley, often venturing deep into the woods to hidden clearings where they would spend hours talking about their futures, their fears, and their dreams. In a town where entertainment options were limited to the single movie theater that showed films 3 months after their big city release, or the bowling alley that had seen better days in the 1970s, these wilderness excursions had become their sanctuary. October 15th, 1994, had begun like any other Saturday. The autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the maple trees lining Main Street blazed with colors so vivid they seemed almost unreal. Jessica had worked her usual morning shift at Carmichael's Hardware, helping customers select the right screws for their projects, and listening to the endless stream of local gossip that flowed through the store like a river. Timmy had spent the morning in his family's garage, helping his father tune up the end of Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick, their hands black with grease, but their conversation easy and comfortable. Amanda had dedicated her morning to studying for her upcoming SEATs, her bedroom desk covered with preparation books and carefully organized notes written in her precise handwriting. The plan, as later reconstructed by investigators, had been simple and entirely innocent. The three friends intended to meet at 2 o'clock that afternoon at their favorite trailhead, located on the eastern edge of town, where Maple Street dissolved into a dirt road that wound its way into the heart of the state forest. They had discovered a new trail the previous weekend, one that wasn't marked on any of the official park maps, and they were eager to explore where it might lead. Amanda had packed her usual assortment of granola bars and bottled water in her well-worn backpack. Timmy had loaded his camera with a fresh roll of film, excited about the possibility of capturing the peak autumn foliage in the golden hour light that would arrive later in the afternoon. Jessica had brought along her journal, a leather-bound notebook where she recorded her thoughts and observations about the world around her. At exactly 1:47 p.m., Jessica had kissed her mother goodbye and climbed into her pride and joy, a powder blue 1987 Honda Civic that she had purchased with money saved from 2 summers of working at the hardware store. Her mother, Linda Carmichael, would later tell investigators that Jessica had seemed excited but not unusually so, mentioning that she planned to be home by 6 o'clock for the family's weekly Saturday night pizza dinner. At 1:52 p.m., Timmy had shouldered his camera bag and called out to his father that he would be back before dark. His father, David Henderson, barely looked up from the transmission he was rebuilding, simply waving a grease-stained hand in acknowledgement. It was a casual goodbye that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At 1:56 p.m., Amanda had locked the front door of the Fletcher family's white colonial house and walked the 3 blocks to the trailhead, her hiking boots crunching through the fallen leaves that carpeted the sidewalk. She had chosen to walk rather than drive, as she often did when the weather was nice and she wanted time to think. What happened next would become the central mystery that would consume the Millbrook Valley Police Department, the Pennsylvania State Police, and eventually the FBI for months to come. At approximately 2:15 p.m., local resident Margaret Collins was walking her elderly golden retriever, Buster, along the dirt road that led to the trailhead when she noticed Jessica's distinctive blue Honda parked in the small gravel clearing that served as an unofficial parking area for hikers. Collins, a retired school teacher who had known all 3 teenagers since they were children, thought nothing of seeing the car there. The kids were known for their weekend hiking adventures, and she had encountered them on the trails dozens of times over the years. But by 6 o'clock that evening, when Jessica failed to appear for her family's pizza dinner, concern began to ripple through the close-knit community. Linda Carmichael called the Henderson house first, then the Fletcher residence. Neither Timmy nor Amanda had returned home either. By 7 o'clock, as darkness settled over Millbrook Valley like a heavy blanket, David Henderson and James Fletcher had joined Robert Carmichael at the trailhead. Jessica's Honda sat exactly where Mrs. Collins had seen it hours earlier, but there was no sign of the 3 teenagers. The men called out their names until their voices grew hoarse, their flashlight beams dancing through the shadows between the trees like desperate fireflies. At 8:23 p.m., Robert Carmichael made the phone call that would change everything, his voice shaking with a fear he had never experienced before. He dialed 911 and reported his daughter and her friends missing. Chief of Police Daniel Morrison had been looking forward to a quiet Saturday evening when the call came in. A 20-year veteran of law enforcement who had worked his way up from patrolman to chief in the peaceful confines of Millbrook Valley, Morrison had dealt with his share of missing persons cases over the years, but they had always involved confused elderly residents who had wandered away from nursing homes, or occasionally a troubled teenager who had run away after an argument with their parents. The missing persons were always found within a few hours, usually embarrassed and apologetic. This case felt different from the moment Morrison arrived at the trailhead. The initial search began immediately, Despite the handicap of darkness, Morrison called in every available officer, all 4 of them, along with the volunteer fire department, and several dozen community members who had heard about the missing teenagers through the town's remarkably efficient gossip network. Armed with flashlights, lanterns, and portable radios, the search party spread out along the network of trails that radiated from the parking area, like the spokes of a wheel. The searchers found Jessica's footprints almost immediately. Her distinctive hiking boots left clear impressions in the mud near the stream that ran parallel to the main trail. But after following the tracks for nearly half a mile, they simply vanished, as if she had been lifted into the air and carried away. Timmy's tracks were found along a different trail, leading deeper into the forest toward a rocky outcropping that was popular with local photographers. But like Jessica's, his trail ended abruptly with no explanation. Most disturbing of all were Amanda's tracks. The search party found them leading off the main trail toward a densely wooded area that was known to be difficult to navigate even in daylight. But her footprints were not alone. Beside them, clearly visible in the soft earth, were the tracks of what appeared to be heavy work boots, much larger than anything the 3 teenagers would have worn. As the search continued through the night and into the following day, the mystery only deepened. Dogs, brought in from the county seat, picked up the scents of all 3 teenagers, but lost them at various points throughout the forest, as if the trails simply ended in mid-air. The Pennsylvania State Police arrived on Sunday morning with additional resources and expertise, transforming the peaceful trailhead into a command center buzzing with activity. Detective Lieutenant Frank Kowalski, a 30-year veteran of the state police, who had worked some of the most challenging cases in the region, took charge of the investigation. A man whose weathered face reflected years of dealing with humanity's darkest impulses. Kowalski had seen enough missing persons cases to know that time was their enemy. The first 72 hours were critical, and they were already racing against the clock. The interviews began immediately. Every person who had been in the area on Saturday afternoon was questioned thoroughly. Mrs. Collins, who had seen Jessica's car, was interviewed 3 separate times, with investigators hoping she might remember some detail that could provide a crucial lead. But her story remained consistent. She had seen the blue Honda, noticed nothing unusual, and continued on her walk with Buster. The investigation into the teenagers' backgrounds revealed nothing that might explain their disappearance. All 3 were honor students with no history of drug use, criminal activity, or association with dangerous individuals. Their friends described them as responsible, reliable, and deeply committed to each other. The idea that they might have run away together was quickly dismissed. Amanda's college acceptance letters and scholarship opportunities represented too much to abandon. Jessica's journalism aspirations were too important to her, and Timmy's deep connection to his family and hometown made it unthinkable that he would simply vanish without a word. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation expanded to include every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius, every parolee with a history of violent crime, and every individual who had been reported in the area on the day of the disappearance. FBI behavior analysts created profiles of potential suspects, while forensic teams scoured every inch of the forest floor for evidence that might have been missed in the initial search. The discovery that sent chills through the investigation team came on October 28th, 13 days after the disappearance. A state police search team working their way through a particularly dense section of forest, nearly 3 miles from the trailhead, found Timmy's camera bag hanging from a branch approximately 8 feet off the ground. The bag was undamaged and still contained his Canon AA1, but the roll of film inside had been exposed to light and was completely ruined. The location of the camera bag made no sense. The branch from which it hung was far too high for Timmy to have reached. Even if he had jumped, there were no other trees nearby that he could have climbed to access that particular branch. Most disturbing of all, the bag showed no signs of having been thrown or tossed up into the tree. It was hung carefully, deliberately, as if someone had wanted it to be found. 2 days later, Amanda's backpack was discovered in an equally impossible location. Found by a volunteer searcher nearly 4 miles from the trailhead, the backpack was sitting in the exact center of a small clearing, positioned as if it had been placed there with mathematical precision. The granola bars and water bottles were still inside, untouched and perfectly arranged. But Amanda's wallet, which her parents insisted she always carried, was missing. Jessica's journal was the last item to be found, and its discovery would haunt investigators for years to come. Located on November 15th, exactly 1 month after the disappearance, the leather-bound notebook was found lying open on a flat rock beside a stream that was more than 5 miles from the original trailhead. The final entry, dated October 15, 1994, contained Jessica's thoughts about the upcoming hike and her excitement about exploring the new trail. But written below her final entry in handwriting that appeared to be hers but somehow different, more hurried, more desperate, were 4 words that chilled everyone who read them. "He knows our secret." The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. Some experts believed it was Jessica's writing, albeit produced under extreme stress. Others argued that it was a deliberate forgery, created by someone who had studied her handwriting carefully enough to mimic it convincingly. But everyone agreed on one thing: the words had been written after her original entry, and they suggested a knowledge or discovery that had put the 3 friends in mortal danger. As autumn turned to winter, the investigation began to lose momentum. Despite hundreds of interviews, thousands of man-hours of searching, and the involvement of multiple law enforcement agencies, no trace of Jessica, Timmy, or Amanda had been found beyond their scattered belongings. The FBI gradually reduced their presence. The state police reassigned their investigators to other cases, and Chief Morrison found himself alone with a mystery that seemed to have no solution. The families refused to give up hope. Linda and Robert Carmichael plastered the region with missing person flyers bearing Jessica's photograph, her green eyes seeming to follow passers-by with a haunting intensity. David Henderson spent his weekends walking the forest trails, calling his son's name into the wilderness and listening for a response that never came. Dr. Patricia Fletcher hired private investigators, psychics, and anyone else who claimed they might be able to find her daughter. But as 1994 turned to 1995 and then to 1996, the case of the 3 missing teenagers began to fade from public consciousness. New tragedies captured the community's attention, new mysteries emerged to challenge law enforcement, and life in Millbrook Valley slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yet for those who had known and loved Jessica, Timmy, and Amanda, normalcy would forever remain elusive. The families moved away one by one, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss. The trailhead where the 3 friends had last been seen was eventually closed to the public, the official reason being budget constraints. But everyone knew the real motivation was the number of amateur investigators and curiosity seekers who continued to arrive hoping to solve the mystery. Chief Morrison retired in 1998, his final official act being to seal the case files in the department's evidence room. In his farewell address to the community, he spoke about the investigation that had defined his final years in law enforcement, his voice heavy with the weight of failure and regret. "Some mysteries," he said, "are not meant to be solved by mortal men. Some secrets are buried so deep that they may never see the light of day. But I want the families to know, and I want this community to know, that we never stopped searching. We never stopped hoping, and somewhere in those woods, the truth is waiting for someone with the wisdom and persistence to find it." Those words would prove to be more prophetic than Morrison could have ever imagined, because 30 years later, in the autumn of 2024, that truth would finally begin to emerge from the shadows, brought to light by a discovery so unexpected and so disturbing that it would force everyone to re-examine everything they thought they knew about that terrible day in the story of what really happened to Jessica Lynn Carmichael, Timothy Paul Henderson, and Amanda Rose Fletcher was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The autumn of 2024 arrived in Millbrook Valley with the same golden splendor that had painted the town 30 years earlier, but the community that witnessed those changing leaves bore little resemblance to the close-knit enclave that had been shattered by the disappearance of 3 teenagers in. Progress had arrived slowly but inevitably: a new shopping center on the outskirts of town, a Starbucks where the old Five and Dime used to stand, and rows of suburban developments where cornfields had once stretched toward the horizon. The old police station had been demolished in 2019, replaced by a modern facility that reflected the town's gradual transformation from rural community to suburban bedroom community for the growing metropolitan area. Chief Morrison's sealed case files had been transferred to the new building's climate-controlled evidence room, where they sat alongside hundreds of other boxes containing the detritus of decades of small-town law enforcement. It was in this sterile environment that Detective Riley Walsh first encountered the case that would consume the next year of her life. Walsh, 34 years old and recently transferred from the Philadelphia Police Department, had come to Millbrook Valley, seeking a quieter pace and the chance to raise her 2 young children away from the urban chaos that had defined her first decade in law enforcement. She had expected her new position to involve domestic disputes, traffic violations, and the occasional break-in, not a mystery that had haunted the community for 3 decades. The catalyst for reopening the case came from an unexpected source: the death of Eleanor Whitfield, the elderly art teacher who had once encouraged Timmy Henderson to pursue his passion for photography. Miss Whitfield had passed away peacefully in her sleep on September 23, 2024, at the age of 89, leaving behind a modest estate and a house filled with decades of accumulated memories. Her nephew, Michael Whitfield, had driven up from Baltimore to settle his aunt's affairs and prepare the house for sale. A successful real estate attorney who had visited his aunt perhaps a dozen times over the years, Michael knew very little about her life beyond the basic facts. She had taught art at the high school for 42 years, had never married, and had been devoted to her students with a passion that bordered on the maternal. The house on Elm Street was a craftsman-style bungalow that had been built in the 1920s, its rooms filled with the accumulated treasures of a life dedicated to education and art. Every wall displayed student artwork spanning decades, from primitive finger paintings to sophisticated oil portraits that could have hung in galleries. Miss Whitfield had apparently saved everything, creating an inadvertent museum of artistic development that told the story of countless young lives. It was while clearing out the basement that Michael made the discovery that would change everything. Behind a stack of canvas paintings and beneath a paint-stained top, he found an antique steamer trunk that looked as if it hadn't been opened in decades. The brass fittings had turned green with age, and the leather straps were cracked and brittle. But what caught Michael's attention was the padlock securing the trunk, a modern, heavy-duty lock that seemed completely out of place on such an old piece of luggage. Curiosity overcoming caution, Michael used a crowbar to break the lock. The hinges protested with a screech of rusted metal as he lifted the lid, releasing a musty odor that spoke of secrets long hidden. What he found inside would have sent most people directly to the police, but Michael's legal training made him photograph everything carefully before disturbing the scene. The trunk contained what appeared to be a shrine dedicated to the 3 missing teenagers. Dozens of photographs covered the bottom, not just the school pictures that had appeared in newspapers and on missing person flyers, but candid shots that seemed to have been taken without the subject's knowledge. Jessica emerging from her family's hardware store, her arms full of packages, Timmy walking alone through the cemetery behind the Methodist church, his camera bag slung over his shoulder, Amanda studying in the public library, her face illuminated by the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. But these photographs were just the beginning. Carefully preserved in plastic sleeves were newspaper clippings about the investigation, police reports that should never have been in civilian hands, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline of the teenagers' movements in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in tissue paper like a precious relic, was Timothy Henderson's missing roll of film, the one that investigators had assumed was ruined when his camera bag was found hanging in the tree. Michael Whitfield may have been a real estate attorney, but he was intelligent enough to recognize evidence when he saw it. Without touching anything further, he called the Millbrook Valley Police Department and found himself speaking to Detective Walsh, who arrived at the Elm Street house within 20 minutes of receiving the call. Walsh's first look into the trunk sent chills down her spine. In her decade with the Philadelphia police, she had worked dozens of cases involving obsessive behavior, but there was something particularly disturbing about the careful organization of this collection. Every photograph was labeled with a date and time written in precise feminine handwriting. Every newspaper clipping was arranged in chronological order. The police reports were photocopies, but they contained information that had never been released to the public. The film canister was sent immediately to the State Police Forensics Laboratory, where technicians worked with painstaking care to develop images that had been hidden for 30 years. The results were both enlightening and deeply troubling. The photographs showed the three friends on their final hike, but they also revealed something that had never appeared in any police report. They were not alone in the woods that day. The images, taken with Timmy's characteristic eye for composition and detail, showed Jessica and Amanda posing playfully on a fallen log, the autumn foliage creating a brilliant backdrop. But in several shots, barely visible in the background shadows, was a figure watching them. The person was too far away and too obscured by trees to be identified, but their presence was undeniable. Someone had been following the three friends, observing them, waiting for the right moment to act. But the most chilling photograph was the last one on the roll. It showed the trail ahead of them, empty and peaceful in the afternoon light, but scratched into the bark of a large oak tree, barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look, were words that made Detective Walsh's blood run cold. The watcher sees all. The handwriting analysis of the labels in Mrs. Whitfield's trunk revealed a match to Eleanor Whitfield herself. The art teacher who had been beloved by generations of students, who had encouraged countless young people to pursue their dreams, had been obsessed with the three missing teenagers. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had she obtained copies of confidential police reports? Why had she been secretly photographing the teenagers before their disappearance? And most disturbing of all, what did she know about what had really happened on that October afternoon in Detective Walsh's investigation into Eleanor Whitfield's background revealed a woman whose life had been far more complex than anyone had realized. Born in 1935 to a family that had been prominent in Millbrook Valley for generations, Eleanor had been a brilliant student who had received a full scholarship to study art at a prestigious East Coast university. But in 1957, during her senior year, she had suddenly withdrawn from school and returned to Millbrook Valley, citing a family emergency that no one seemed able to explain clearly. She had never left the town again. For 67 years, Eleanor Whitfield had lived in the same house, taught at the same school, and maintained the same quiet, unassuming presence that had made her seem almost invisible to her neighbors. But Walsh's investigation revealed that invisible did not mean inactive. Financial records showed that Eleanor had spent thousands of dollars over the years on private investigators, surveillance equipment, and photography supplies. Phone records from 1994 revealed dozens of calls to law enforcement agencies, private detectives, and forensic laboratories. Eleanor Whitfield had been conducting her own investigation into the disappearance of Jessica, Timmy, and Amanda, an investigation that had apparently yielded results that the official inquiry had missed. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when Walsh examined Eleanor's personal papers, found in a fireproof safe hidden behind a false wall in her bedroom closet. Among the carefully organized documents was a letter dated October 16, 1994, one day after the teenager's disappearance. The letter was addressed to Chief Morrison, but the postmark showed that it had never been mailed. The letter, written in Eleanor's precise handwriting, contained information that would have changed the entire course of the investigation. Chief Morrison, I write to you with information regarding the disappearance of Jessica Carmichael, Timothy Henderson, and Amanda Fletcher. I believe I know what happened to them, and I believe they are in grave danger. For the past 6 months, I have been aware of activities in the woods surrounding our community that can only be described as sinister. I have observed individuals conducting what appear to be ritualistic gatherings in remote clearings, activities that seem to be connected to the old mining operations that were abandoned in the... On the afternoon of October 15th, I followed the 3 students into the woods, concerned for their safety based on information that had come to my attention through my unofficial observations. I witnessed their encounter with an individual who had been watching them for weeks. I saw them being led away from the main trail toward the old mine entrance in Sector 7 of the state forest. I attempted to follow, but I lost sight of them in the dense undergrowth. When I finally reached the mine entrance, I found evidence of a struggle, but the teenagers were nowhere to be seen. I heard sounds coming from deep within the mine shaft, sounds that I cannot describe in writing, but that convinced me that something terrible had happened. I have not come forward publicly because I fear for my own safety. The individual I observed with the teenagers is someone known to our community, someone whose involvement would shock everyone who knows him. But I cannot remain silent when 3 innocent young people may still be alive and in need of rescue. I am prepared to share what I know, but only if you can guarantee my protection. The truth about what happens in those woods is darker than anyone realizes, and there are others involved, others who would do anything to keep their secrets hidden. I will contact you again when I believe it is safe to do so. Eleanor Whitfield. The letter was never sent, but attached to it was a map, hand-drawn in Eleanor's careful style. The map showed the network of trails in the state forest, but it also marked locations that had never appeared on any official survey: abandoned mine shafts, underground chambers, and what appeared to be meeting places hidden deep in the wilderness. Detective Walsh immediately contacted the state police and requested a full forensic team to investigate the locations marked on Eleanor's map. What they found would transform the case from a missing persons investigation into something far more sinister. The first location marked on the map as primary site was a clearing approximately 6 miles from the original trailhead, accessible only by following a series of unmarked deer paths through dense undergrowth. The clearing showed evidence of repeated human activity over many years: fire rings, constructed seating areas, and carved symbols in the surrounding trees. But most disturbing were the personal items found buried in shallow graves around the perimeter: jewelry, clothing, and identification documents belonging to individuals who had been reported missing throughout the region over the past 3 decades. The second location led investigators to a concealed entrance to one of the abandoned iron ore mines that had operated in the area until the 1960s. The mine entrance had been carefully camouflaged with brush and rocks, but Eleanor's map showed its exact location. Inside, forensic teams discovered evidence of long-term human habitations, sleeping areas, food storage, and what appeared to be workshops where various items had been created or modified. But it was the third location that provided the breakthrough investigators had been seeking for 30 years. Marked on Eleanor's map simply as the truth, it led them to a small cave system that branched off from the main mine shaft, hidden behind a rock fall that appeared natural but had actually been carefully constructed. They found a chamber that had been converted into a macabre museum. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, showing various individuals who had visited the woods over the years. Some were hikers and hunters who had apparently been observed without their knowledge. Others showed people who had clearly been taken against their will, their faces reflecting terror and desperation, and prominently displayed in the center of the collection were the missing teenagers: Jessica, Timmy, and Amanda. But these were not the candid surveillance photos found in Eleanor's trunk. These images showed the 3 friends in captivity, bound and confined in what appeared to be the very chamber where the photographs were displayed. The pictures documented their captivity over what appeared to be several days, showing their deteriorating condition and growing despair. The final photograph in the sequence showed all 3 teenagers standing at the edge of what appeared to be a deep shaft, their hands bound behind their backs, their faces reflecting the terrible knowledge of what was about to happen to them. Behind them, Barely visible in the shadows was a figure whose identity would shock the entire community. Detective Walsh recognized him immediately from the old case files. He had been interviewed multiple times during the original investigation, had volunteered to join the search parties, and had been considered above suspicion due to his standing in the community. But there he was, captured in Timmy's final photograph 30 years earlier, the orchestrator of their disappearance and the guardian of secrets that had remained hidden for 3 decades. The man in the photograph was Dr. Harrison Vale, who in 1994 had been Millbrook Valley's beloved family physician, trusted by generations of residents and revered as a pillar of the community. He had delivered half the babies in town, had treated countless injuries and illnesses, and had been known for his gentle bedside manner and his dedication to his patients. But Dr. Vale had harbored secrets that would have horrified anyone who knew him. The evidence found in the chamber revealed that he had been the leader of a group that had operated in the woods for decades, conducting activities that defied comprehension. Missing persons reports from across the region dating back to the 1970s suddenly took on new significance as investigators realized they were dealing with a serial predator who had used his medical knowledge and community standing to avoid suspicion for decades. The discovery of Dr. Vale's involvement explained many of the mysteries that had plagued the original investigation. His access to medical records had allowed him to identify potential victims who might not be missed immediately. His knowledge of the local terrain, gained through decades of house calls to remote farms and hunting expeditions with prominent citizens, had given him intimate familiarity with the hidden places where evidence could be concealed, and his standing in the community had made it unthinkable that anyone would suspect him of involvement in the teenager's disappearance. But Dr. Vale had been dead for 15 years, having passed away in 2009 after a brief battle with cancer. He had taken his secrets to the grave, leaving behind a reputation as a beloved healer and no hint of the darkness that had defined his true nature. The investigation into Dr. Vale's past revealed a pattern of behavior that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Medical records showed an unusual number of patients who had required treatment for injuries sustained during hiking accidents in the state forest. Police reports revealed dozens of incidents involving people who had become lost or disoriented in the woods, often requiring search and rescue operations that Dr. Vale had volunteered to support. Most chilling of all was the discovery of Dr. Vale's private journals, found hidden in a false wall of his former medical office, which had been converted to a coffee shop after his death. The journals documented his activities over a 30-year period, written in a clinical, detached style that revealed a mind capable of compartmentalizing the most horrific acts. The entries from October 1994 provided the final piece of the puzzle that had haunted Millbrook Valley for 3 decades. Vale had been watching Jessica, Timmy, and Amanda for months, studying their routines and planning their capture with the methodical precision of a scientist designing an experiment. He had known about their weekend hiking trips, had observed their favorite trails, and had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to add them to his collection. But something had gone wrong with his carefully laid plans. According to his journal entries, the teenagers had discovered something during their captivity, something that had terrified Dr. Vale enough to accelerate his timeline and dispose of the evidence more quickly than he had intended. The final entry, dated October 19, 1994, 4 days after the teenager's disappearance, contained a single chilling line: "The girl knew too much. They all had to disappear permanently. The secret must be protected at all costs." Detective Walsh's investigation had answered many questions about what had happened to Jessica, Timmy, and Amanda, but it had also raised new mysteries that would prove even more disturbing than the original disappearance. What secret had the teenagers discovered that had sealed their fate? Who else had been involved in Dr. Vale's activities? And most importantly, what had happened to the 3 friends after that final photograph was taken? The answers to those questions lay deeper in the mind system, in chambers that investigators had not yet explored, waiting to reveal truths that would shake Millbrook Valley to its very foundations. The deeper chambers of the mind system yielded secrets that would forever change how the residents of Millbrook Valley understood their community's history. As Detective Walsh and the forensic teams pushed further into the underground labyrinth, following Eleanor Whitfield's meticulously drawn map, they discovered that Dr. Vale's activities had been far more extensive and far more connected to the town's power structure than anyone could have imagined. The fourth location marked on Eleanor's map led to a chamber that served as Dr. Vale's private office, a grotesque mirror of his legitimate medical practice above ground. Makeshift examination tables bore the stains of procedures that had nothing to do with healing. Medical instruments, some dating back decades, were arranged with the same obsessive precision that had characterized his official practice. But most disturbing were the detailed medical records he had kept on dozens of individuals, records that documented experiments and procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics. Among these files, Detective Walsh found the complete medical histories of Jessica Carmichael, Timothy Henderson, and Amanda Fletcher. Vale had been their family physician since childhood, had administered their vaccinations, had treated their childhood illnesses, and had maintained detailed psychological profiles on each of them. The files revealed a man who had been studying his future victims with the patience of a predator, noting their physical capabilities, psychological strengths and weaknesses, and social connections. But Jessica's file contained additional notations that set it apart from the others. In the margins of her medical records, Vale had written observations about her investigative instincts, her ability to notice details that others missed, and her tendency to ask probing questions about things that seemed out of place. The final notation, dated September 15, 1994, exactly 1 month before the disappearance, was particularly chilling. Subject demonstrates concerning level of curiosity about local missing persons cases. Recommend immediate escalation of timeline. The answer to what Jessica had discovered lay in the fifth chamber, the deepest point that Eleanor's map had marked. This room had served as Dr. Vale's archive, containing decades of documentation that revealed the true scope of his activities. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer carefully labeled and organized with the same methodical precision that had characterized his medical practice. The files contained police reports, newspaper clippings, and personal correspondence related to every missing person case in the region dating back to now. But these were not the random collection of a crime enthusiast. They were the records of someone who had intimate knowledge of each disappearance because he had been responsible for orchestrating them. More disturbing still were the photographs and documentation revealing that Dr. Vale had not been working alone. The files identified a network of individuals who had participated in or facilitated his activities over the decades. Some were prominent citizens whose involvement would have seemed impossible to believe. The former mayor, 2 county commissioners, the police chief who had preceded Morrison, and several wealthy businessmen who had shaped the region's development for decades. But it was a leather-bound journal hidden behind the filing cabinets that provided the key to understanding Jessica's fatal discovery. The journal, written in Field's precise handwriting, documented what he called the Millbrook Project, a decades-long effort to transform their small community into what he described as a laboratory for social experimentation. The project had begun in the early 1970s, when Dr. Vale and several other prominent citizens had formed what they called the Developmental Council, ostensibly created to guide the town's economic growth and preserve its character. The council had actually been designed to control every aspect of life in Millbrook Valley. They had influenced zoning decisions to limit population growth, had steered economic development to maintain their control over local resources, and had systematically removed individuals who threatened their vision for the community. The missing persons over the decades had not been random victims. They had been carefully selected threats to the council's control. People who asked too many questions, who opposed development plans, who threatened to expose corruption, or who simply possessed information that could undermine the council's authority, had been systematically eliminated. Dr. Vale's medical practice had made him the perfect instrument for this elimination process. His access to homes throughout the community, his knowledge of residents' health conditions and medications, and his ability to move freely at all hours without suspicion had made him an ideal predator. But more than that, his medical expertise had allowed him to identify individuals whose disappearance would be attributed to natural causes, accidents, or voluntary departure from the community. The journal revealed that Jessica Carmichael had somehow discovered evidence of the council's activities. Her work for the school newspaper had led her to research local history for a series of articles about Millbrook Valley's development over the decades. In the process, she had noticed patterns that had escaped everyone else's attention: too many missing persons, too many convenient accidents, too many instances of people who had opposed certain development projects suddenly leaving town or disappearing entirely. Jessica had been methodical in her research, using her access to newspaper archives and public records to construct a timeline that revealed the true nature of what had been happening in Millbrook Valley for decades. She had identified the common thread connecting the disappearances. Each person had been a patient of Dr. Vale, and each had been involved in some form of opposition to projects supported by the town's most prominent citizens. But Jessica's investigation had gone beyond pattern recognition. The journal revealed that she had somehow obtained copies of internal documents from the Developmental Council, documents that explicitly outlined their plans for population control and elimination of threats. Vale had become aware of Jessica's investigation when she had scheduled an appointment with him to ask questions about several of his former patients who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The meeting, which had taken place on October 10, 1994, 5 days before the disappearance, had been intended by Jessica as a fishing expedition. She had hoped to gauge Dr. Vale's knowledge of the missing persons and perhaps trick him into revealing information that would confirm her suspicions. But Dr. Vale had immediately recognized the threat she represented and had begun planning her elimination. Timothy Henderson and Amanda Fletcher had become targets not because of their own discoveries, but because of their proximity to Jessica. The journal revealed that Dr. Vale had considered eliminating Jessica alone, but had ultimately decided that her friends possessed too much knowledge of her investigation to be allowed to survive. Amanda, in particular, was deemed a threat because of her intelligence and her family's legal connections that might give her the resources to pursue Jessica's investigation if something happened to her friend. The plan for their elimination had been weeks in the making. Dr. Vale had studied their hiking routines, had identified the perfect location for their capture, and had prepared the underground chambers to hold them while he decided on their ultimate fate. But according to his journal, something had gone catastrophically wrong during their captivity. On the second day of their imprisonment, Jessica had somehow managed to communicate with her captors in a way that had terrified Dr. Vale and his associates. The journal entry from October 17, 1994, revealed the source of his panic. "The Carmichael girl knows everything. She has documented evidence of our activities going back years, and she has hidden copies in multiple locations. Worse, she claims to have mailed copies to law enforcement agencies outside our jurisdiction. She is demanding the release of all 3 teenagers in exchange for her silence, but we cannot trust her to honor such an agreement. The situation has become untenable. More disturbing still, she has revealed knowledge of activities that we believed were completely secret. She knows about the mine system, about the disposal methods, and about the participation of council members in the elimination process. She has somehow gained access to information that should have been impossible for a high school student to obtain. We have no choice but to proceed with permanent elimination. But we must also locate and destroy all evidence she may have hidden. The project cannot be compromised by the investigative efforts of a teenage journalist." The final entries in Dr. Vale's journal painted a picture of a desperate man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Jessica's investigation had been more thorough than anyone had realized, and her preparations for exposing the truth had been methodical and comprehensive. She had apparently anticipated that her investigation might put her in danger, and had taken steps to ensure that the truth would emerge even if something happened to her. But those precautions had not been enough to save her or her friends. The journal's final entry, dated October 20th, 1994, contained a single paragraph that chilled Detective Walsh to the bone. The elimination has been completed. All 3 subjects have been processed according to standard protocols. Physical evidence has been disposed of in the deep shaft system, beyond the reach of any future investigation. Documentation related to their elimination has been secured in the archive chamber. The Carmichael evidence cache remains unlocated, but we believe it was contained to materials in her possession at the time of capture. The project continues. Detective Walsh's investigation into the evidence cache that had so terrified Dr. Vale led to the discovery of Jessica's true legacy. Working with federal investigators who had been brought in to handle the expanding scope of the case, Walsh traced Jessica's final weeks through her school records, library checkout history, and interviews with classmates who remembered her research project. The breakthrough came when investigators contacted the elderly librarian who had worked at Millbrook Valley Public Library, and Martha Reynolds, now 91 and living in a nursing home in the county seat, remembered Jessica clearly, not just as a regular patron, but as a young woman who had asked unusual questions about archived materials and had spent hours copying documents using the library's microfilm reader. Mrs. Reynolds led investigators to a discovery that validated Jessica's intelligence and foresight. Hidden behind a false back panel in an old card catalog drawer that had been retired when the library computerized its system, they found a manila envelope containing photocopies of documents that Jessica had apparently hidden as insurance against exactly what had happened to her. The envelope contained copies of internal memoranda from the Developmental Council, financial records showing payments to Dr. Vale for undefined consultation services, and a detailed analysis written in Jessica's clear handwriting that connected dozens of missing persons cases to the conspiracy she had uncovered. But most remarkably, it also contained a letter addressed to whoever finds this, dated October 14th, 1994, one day before her disappearance. The letter demonstrated that Jessica had not only understood the danger she was facing, but had actually planned for the possibility that she might not survive to expose the truth herself. To whoever finds this evidence, my name is Jessica Lynn Carmichael, and I am a senior at Millbrook Valley High School. If you are reading this, it probably means that something has happened to me before I could expose the truth about what has been happening in our community for decades. I have spent months investigating a pattern of disappearances and suspicious deaths that I believe are connected to a conspiracy involving some of the most prominent citizens in Millbrook Valley. The evidence I have gathered proves that a group calling itself the Developmental Council has been systematically eliminating people who threaten their control over our community. Dr. Harrison Vale is the primary agent of these eliminations. His position as our family physician gives him access to homes, medical records, and the trust of potential victims. He has been using his medical knowledge to make murders appear like natural deaths or accidents, and he has been disposing of bodies in an abandoned mine system in the state forest. I believe that other members of this conspiracy include Mayor Davidson, Police Chief Franklin, County Commissioner Mills, and several prominent businessmen whose names are documented in the attached materials. They have been operating for at least 20 years, possibly longer. I am sharing this information with my best friends Timothy Henderson and Amanda Fletcher because I trust them completely and because I believe they deserve to know the truth about the danger we may all be facing. If something happens to all 3 of us, please know that we discovered this conspiracy through legitimate research and investigation, not through any illegal activity on our part. The evidence I have gathered is substantial and should be enough to expose this conspiracy and bring justice for all of their victims. I have tried to be thorough and accurate in my documentation, and I believe everything here can be verified through official records. Please don't let our deaths be in vain. Please make sure the truth comes out, no matter how difficult it may be for our community to accept. Jessica Lynn Carmichael, October 4th. The discovery of Jessica's evidence cache led to arrests that rocked Millbrook Valley to its foundation. Several members of the original Developmental Council were still alive in 2024, and federal prosecutors moved quickly to file charges against the surviving conspirators. The investigation expanded to include state and federal agencies as the true scope of the conspiracy became apparent. Over the following months, as investigators worked through the massive archive of evidence found in Dr. Vale's underground chambers, the full horror of what had been happening in Millbrook Valley for decades finally emerged. The missing persons cases that had been attributed to voluntary relocations, hunting accidents, and natural disasters were revealed to be carefully orchestrated murders designed to maintain the conspirators' control over the community. But perhaps the most tragic discovery was the location of the teenagers' remains. Following Dr. Vale's journal references to the deep shaft system, investigators found a natural cave system that extended far beneath the mine tunnels. In the deepest accessible chamber, they recovered the skeletal remains of Jessica, Timothy, and Amanda, along with the remains of dozens of other victims spanning decades. The three friends were finally laid to rest in Millbrook Valley Cemetery on a crisp November day in 2024. Exactly 30 years and 1 month after their disappearance, the entire community turned out for the funeral service, many of them struggling to comprehend how such evil had existed undetected in their midst for so long. Detective Walsh stood at the graveside as the final prayers were spoken, thinking about the extraordinary courage that Jessica Carmichael had shown in her final weeks. At 17 years old, she had uncovered a conspiracy that had eluded law enforcement for decades, had documented evidence that would ultimately bring justice for dozens of victims, and had demonstrated a maturity and foresight that had ensured the truth would eventually emerge even after her death. But as the mourners dispersed and the cemetery returned to its peaceful silence, Walsh found herself troubled by one final mystery that had emerged from the investigation. Among Vale's papers, investigators had found references to what he called Phase 2 of the Millbrook Project, expansion of their activities to other communities in the region. The references suggested that the conspiracy had begun establishing similar operations in other small towns, using the lessons learned in Millbrook Valley to refine their methods and expand their control. Federal investigators were already working to identify other communities where unexplained disappearances and suspicious deaths might indicate the presence of similar conspiracies. The investigation that had begun with the discovery of a trunk in Eleanor Whitfield's basement had revealed not just the truth about 3 missing teenagers, but evidence of a network of corruption and evil that had spread far beyond the borders of one small Pennsylvania town. As Detective Walsh drove away from the cemetery, she reflected on the words that Chief Morrison had spoken at his retirement nearly 3 decades earlier. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved by mortal men. He had been wrong about that. The mystery of what happened to Jessica, Timothy, and Amanda had been solved not by supernatural intervention, but by the courage of a 17-year-old girl who had refused to ignore the evidence of evil around her, and by the dedication of investigators who had refused to let the truth remain buried. The case of the Millbrook Valley disappearances was officially closed on December 15, 2024, but its impact would be felt for years to come. Jessica Carmichael's investigation had not only brought justice for herself and her friends, but had exposed a level of corruption and conspiracy that would lead to reforms in how small communities investigated missing persons cases. And in the archives of the Pennsylvania State Police, Jessica's letter would be preserved as a testament to the power of ordinary citizens to uncover extraordinary evil, and as a reminder that sometimes the most important investigations are conducted not by trained professionals, but by young people with the courage to ask difficult questions and the determination to seek the truth, no matter the cost. The 3 friends had not died in vain. Their story would serve as a warning, an inspiration, and ultimately a victory for justice over the darkest impulses of human nature.